May 16, 1969. 25 kilometers north-northeast of Nui Dat, Phuoc Thi Province. Squadron leader Brian Dairu checks his weapon selector. 19 rockets armed. 2 miniguns charged. 4,000 rounds ready to feed. Below him, for Australian SAS soldiers are 30 seconds from being overrun. Dairu rolls Bushranger 71 into the firing pass. Rockets away. He watches the smoke trail arc toward the jungle canopy, directly toward the hovering extraction helicopter's rotor disc. For 2 seconds, time stops. The rocket passes 2 meters in front of the windscreen. The New Zealand pilot's voice crackles over the radio. "Hey, that's getting a bit bloody close." But the SAS team on the ground has a different assessment. "That's shit-hot Bushrangers, you're right into them." The weapon that made that impossible shot? 2 6-barreled machines mounted on a modified Iroquois helicopter. Each one capable of firing 4,000 rounds per minute. Each one derived from a gun designed for supersonic jet fighters, miniaturized for helicopter warfare. North Vietnamese prisoners would later use one word to describe them: terrifying. June 1966. Australia commits helicopter forces to the Vietnam War. No. 9 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, deploys 8 Bell UH-1B Iroquois helicopters to Vung Tau. Their mission: transport infantry and provide logistic support for the first Australian task force operating in Phuoc Thi Province. The terrain they'd be fighting over was unlike anything in the Australian military experience. Triple canopy jungles so dense that landing zones measured barely 20 meters across, swamps that could swallow a man whole, and enemy forces who'd been fighting in that environment for decades. The Americans had already learned the hard way. By 1966, over 2,100 U.S. helicopters had been shot down or destroyed in Vietnam. Door gunners manning M60 machine guns faced an average combat life expectancy of just 2 weeks. The mathematics were brutal. Over 10% of all Vietnam casualties were helicopter crew members, most of them gunners trying to defend their aircraft with weapons that hadn't been designed for aerial combat. For Australian forces, the problem was even more acute. 9 Squadron's area of operations centered on the dense jungle and rubber plantations of Phuoc Thi Province, perfect ambush country. SAS reconnaissance patrols routinely operated deep behind enemy lines, often surrounded by numerically superior forces. When they called for extraction, they needed fire support that could suppress an entire company of North Vietnamese Army regulars long enough to get men on ropes and out of the jungle. Standard M60 door guns weren't cutting it. With a rate of fire around 550 rounds per minute and frequent jamming in humid conditions, a pair of M60s simply couldn't put enough lead in the air to keep enemy heads down during critical extraction moments. The U.S. Army had begun experimenting with various gunship configurations, but their solutions, bulky, complex weapon systems designed for large-scale American operations, didn't fit Australian tactics or maintenance capabilities. By mid-1967, 9 Squadron had suffered its first casualties. On October 18, Iroquois A2-1018 struck trees while inserting troops into a small clearing, burst into flames. The crew survived, but the message was clear: Australian helicopters needed more firepower, and they needed it configured for the specific demands of supporting small SAS teams in dense jungle, not large-scale air cavalry operations. The Australians needed a weapon that could deliver sustained, overwhelming fire from a helicopter platform. They needed something that wouldn't jam in 100% humidity. They needed something that could be mounted, maintained, and employed by a squadron operating thousands of miles from home with limited spare parts. They needed something that didn't exist yet. So they decided to build it themselves. The helicopter door gun problem wasn't just about firepower. It was about physics, reliability, and human endurance under the worst possible conditions. The American M60 machine gun, standard armament on most helicopters, fired 7.62 mm NATO ammunition at approximately 550 rounds per minute. In theory, respectable. In practice, catastrophic. The M60's gas-operated system relied on consistent pressure from each round firing to cycle the action. At altitude, in humid jungle air, with ammunition exposed to monsoon conditions, that consistency evaporated. Failure to feed malfunctions were routine. Barrel overheating after just 200-round bursts meant gunners had to conserve fire during the very moments they needed maximum suppression. The mathematics told the story. During a typical hot extraction, helicopter hovering exposed for 30 to 45 seconds while troops grabbed ropes. Two M60s firing intermittent bursts might deliver 400 to 500 rounds total. Against an enemy company dispersed across a 100-meter perimeter, that worked out to perhaps 4 to 5 rounds per enemy soldier. Not enough to make anyone keep their head down. Not enough to survive. The British L7A2 general-purpose machine gun, used by Australian ground forces, offered no better solution. Slightly more reliable than the M60 but similarly limited in rate of fire, it couldn't generate the volume of fire needed for aerial suppression. The Americans had tried various solutions. The M134 Minigun, spinning at 2,000 to 4,000 rounds per minute, showed promise but came packaged in the massive XM-21 armament system. Twin miniguns, twin rocket pods, all controlled from the co-pilot station. The system weighed over 1,200 pounds fully loaded and required extensive helicopter modifications. It worked for American air cavalry units flying dedicated gunship missions with specialized maintenance support. But 9 Squadron couldn't afford to convert half their fleet to gunships. They needed multi-role aircraft that could provide fire support 1 hour and evacuate wounded the next. The enemy, meanwhile, had weapons ideally suited to their tactics. The Soviet-designed RPD and RPK light machine guns fired the intermediate 7.62 by 39 mm round, lower recoil, easier to control in jungle conditions, reliable even when caked with mud. More importantly, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong understood the value of massed small arms fire. When Australian helicopters approached, 20 or 30 rifles would open up simultaneously, creating what pilots described as a tunnel of green tracers. Wing Commander Brian Dairu, 9 Squadron's air weapons officer, had studied the problem methodically. The ideal gunship weapon needed to deliver at least 3,000 rounds per minute, 6 times the output of an M60. It needed to be electrically driven rather than gas-operated, eliminating reliability issues from variable ammunition quality. It needed to be modular enough to install and remove quickly, preserving aircraft flexibility. And it needed to be controllable by the pilot or co-pilot, freeing door gunners to use handheld M60s to cover the helicopter's blind spots. By early 1968, the conclusion was unavoidable. 9 Squadron needed the M134 Minigun's firepower without the XM-21's complexity. They needed a custom weapons system that didn't exist in anyone's inventory. They needed to innovate, improvise, and probably bend a few procurement regulations. The question wasn't whether they could build it. The question was whether they could build it before more men died in the jungle. The weapon that would save Australian lives in Vietnam didn't begin in the jungles of Southeast Asia. It began in the stratospheric realm of jet fighters, born from a problem that had nothing to do with helicopters. In 1946, the United States Army awarded General Electric a contract for Project Vulcan, development of an aircraft cannon that could destroy enemy bombers at the unprecedented closing speeds of jet combat. Richard Jordan Gatling's 1860s hand-cranked rotating barrel design offered the solution. By replacing the hand crank with an electric motor and scaling up to 20 mm cannon shells, GE engineers created the M61 Vulcan, 6 rotating barrels, hydraulically driven, capable of firing 6,000 rounds per minute. The Vulcan equipped every American supersonic fighter from the F-104 Starfighter onward. By the early 1960s, Vietnam was exposing gaps in aerial firepower. Attack aircraft needed suppressive weapons for close air support, but the 20 mm Vulcan was overkill, expensive, heavy, and its ammunition too destructive for precision work near friendly forces. What if they scaled it down? General Electric engineers took the M61's rotating barrel principle and miniaturized it for the 7.62 by 51 mm NATO rifle cartridge. 6 barrels, 31.5 inches long, weighing 35 pounds for the gun assembly alone. Electrically driven by a 28-volt DC motor, each barrel fired only 500 to 700 rounds per minute individually, but the 6-barrel configuration delivered an aggregate 2,000 to 4,000 rounds per minute depending on motor speed settings. The external power source eliminated sensitivity to ammunition variations, no gas system to foul, no reciprocating bolt to jam. They designated it the M134. The troops immediately nicknamed it the Minigun, mini compared to the Vulcan, though at 85 pounds fully configured, nobody was calling it lightweight. The weapon first saw combat in 1963, mounted in aircraft gun pods on A-1 Skyraiders providing close air support. The results were immediate and dramatic. Where conventional machine guns stitched sporadic holes in jungle canopy, the minigun's density of fire simply shredded vegetation, creating instant suppression zones. By 1965, miniguns were being mounted on helicopter door frames in various experimental configurations, mostly on U.S. Army UH-1B models. But there was a problem, actually, several problems. The early minigun helicopter mounts vibrated violently. The ammunition feed systems jammed frequently. The blast noise in the cockpit was described by one pilot as, like sitting inside a jackhammer pointed at your skull. And the weapon had a tendency to run away if the speed governor failed, accelerating to destruction-inducing rates exceeding 6,000 rounds per minute. In Australia, Wing Commander Brian Dairou was paying attention. Dairou had joined the RAAF in 1955, trained as a pilot, and by 1968 had accumulated thousands of hours on various aircraft including transport helicopters. When 9 Squadron deployed to Vietnam in 1966, he went as a pilot. By 1968 he'd been appointed the squadron's air weapons officer, responsible for figuring out how to keep Australian helicopters and crews alive in an increasingly deadly environment. Dairou obtained technical manuals for the American XM-21 weapons system. He studied after-action reports. He spoke with U.S. Army helicopter armorers. And he became convinced of one thing: the minigun could work for Australian operations, but not in the configuration the Americans were using. The XM-21's twin miniguns were mounted on pylons extending from the helicopter's sides, controlled by the co-pilot through an electrical firing system. This required extensive modifications to the aircraft's electrical system, hydraulic system for aiming, and structural reinforcement of mounting points. For the U.S. Army with dedicated maintenance facilities and specialized gunship units, this was acceptable. For 9 Squadron, operating 16 helicopters across all missions with a small ground crew, it was impossible. Dairou proposed something simpler and more audacious. Mount miniguns on pilot-controlled pylons, one each side, eliminating the complex co-pilot firing system. Add 7-tube rocket pods for precision strikes. Keep the door-mounted M60s for rear quadrant defense. Create a weapons system that could be installed or removed in under 4 hours, letting the same aircraft fly gunship missions one day and troop transport the next. In March 1968, 9 Squadron conducted its first gunship trials using Iroquois UH-1B serial number A2-1025, which the crew immediately nicknamed Ned Kelly, after Australia's famous Bushranger outlaw. The initial configuration mounted the weapons at the rear of the cargo compartment. Flight tests revealed serious problems. The blast from the miniguns was deafening for pilots, and the weapon's weight distribution affected the helicopter's center of gravity unpredictably. Dairou refused to quit. Working with squadron engineering staff, he redesigned the mount points, moving the miniguns forward to positions just aft of the pilot's doors. This improved weight distribution and directed muzzle blast away from the cockpit. By September 1968, using the newly delivered UH-1H model with serial number A2-773, the configuration was refined enough for combat testing. Then came the hard part: getting official approval. The Australian Department of Defence, understandably, had concerns about field modifications to expensive aircraft involving experimental weapons systems. Through late 1968, A2-773 flew combat missions under operational evaluation status, essentially a loophole allowing Dairou to prove the concept worked before formal approval. In November 1968, Defense Minister Malcolm Fraser visited Vietnam. Squadron personnel prepared A2-773 as a demonstration aircraft, showcasing the Bushranger configuration during Fraser's review. The minister watched the helicopter run through weapon tests, spoke with pilots who'd used the system in combat, and reviewed preliminary effectiveness data. 3 weeks later, official funding arrived. The Bushranger program had just been greenlit. By April 1969, 4 more Iroquois helicopters had been converted to Bushranger configuration. The weapon system that would terrify North Vietnamese forces for the next 2.5 years was now operational. Technical breakdown. The M134 Minigun represents one of the most mechanically complex small arms ever deployed in combat. Understanding why requires understanding its heritage and its radical departure from conventional machine gun design. Core mechanism. Unlike traditional machine guns with a single barrel and gas-operated or recoil-operated cycling system, the M134 employs 6 barrels arranged in a circular cluster around a central drive shaft. Each barrel is a simple, unpowered tube with a fixed chamber and firing mechanism. A 28-volt DC electric motor, mounted separately and connected by a flexible drive shaft, rotates the entire barrel assembly at 500 to 3,000 revolutions per minute depending on settings. As the barrels rotate past the 12 o'clock position, a cam-operated bolt strips a round from the ammunition belt, chambers it, and locks the bolt. At approximately the 4 o'clock position, a fixed firing pin strikes the primer. The round fires. The barrel continues rotating through the 8 o'clock position where an ejection port expels the spent case. Each barrel completes this cycle once per revolution, but with 6 barrels rotating continuously, the weapon achieves a composite fire rate of 2,000 to 4,000 rounds per minute in typical configurations, or up to 6,000 revolutions per minute in maximum rate settings rarely used due to barrel heating concerns. Specifications. The gun unit alone weighs 35 pounds, 15.9 kg. Overall length measures 31.56 inches, 801.6 millimeters. The 6 barrels, each 22 inches, 558.8 millimeters, long, are chrome-lined steel manufactured to extremely tight tolerances. Any imbalance causes catastrophic vibration at operational speeds. The complete system including motor, feeder delinker assembly, and gun control unit weighs approximately 85 pounds, 38.5 kilograms, without ammunition. Ammunition is belt-fed from separate bins holding up to 3,000 rounds. The feeder delinker is a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. It must strip 7.62 by 51 mm NATO rounds from a linked ammunition belt and present them perfectly aligned for the rotating chamber mechanism at rates exceeding 60 rounds per second. A single misalignment causes a jam that can damage multiple barrels. The electric motor draws substantial current, peak loads around 80 amps at 28 volts during startup, settling to 50 to 60 amps during sustained fire. This created challenges for RAAF helicopters, whose electrical systems were designed for avionics and lighting, not power tools consuming 3 times the output of a car starter motor. Bushranger configuration. 9 Squadron solution was elegantly simple. Each Bushranger helicopter carried 2 M134 miniguns, one mounted on an articulated pylon extending from each side of the aircraft, positioned just aft of the pilot and co-pilot doors. The pilot controlled both guns via a floor-mounted trigger switch, aiming by simply flying the helicopter nose on to the target. Elevation was fixed at a slight downward angle optimized for the typical 800-meter gunship orbit pattern flown at 1,500 feet altitude. 4 rockets. The Bushrangers mounted 2 XM159 19-tube pods, each firing 2.75-inch, 70 mm, folding fin aerial rockets. Total rocket capacity, 38 rockets per helicopter. These provided precision engagement capability. Individual rockets could be ripple-fired in groups of 2 to 7, depending on target size and proximity to friendly forces. 2 door-mounted M60 machine guns, operated by the 2 crew chiefs/door gunners, covered the helicopter's rear and flanks. This combination, forward-firing miniguns and rockets controlled by the pilot, plus manually aimed M60s covering blind spots, created a 360-degree defensive capability unique among Vietnam War helicopter gunships. Ammunition load standardized at approximately 4,000 rounds of 7.62 mm for the miniguns, stored in bins positioned to maintain aircraft balance. Door gun M60s carried an additional 2,000 rounds. Total weapons load including pylons, guns, ammunition, and rockets approached 1,500 pounds, a significant but manageable fraction of the UH-1H's payload capacity. Engineering innovations. The Bushranger's genius lay not in revolutionary technology, but in practical implementation. Where American systems used complex electrical firing circuits, the Australian design relied on simple mechanical linkages and pilot-operated switches. Where American mounts required hydraulic adjustment, Australian mounts were fixed, adjusted on the ground if needed but stable and maintenance-free during operations. The ammunition feed system utilized gravity assist, bins positioned slightly higher than gun feed mechanisms, reducing the power required by feeder delinkers and improving reliability. Electrical systems were reinforced but not rebuilt. Squadron electricians added dedicated circuit breakers and heavier gauge wiring to handle minigun current draws. Most importantly, the entire weapons package could be removed in under 4 hours by 3 trained personnel using standard hand tools. A Bushranger could revert to transport configuration overnight and back to gunship configuration the following day. Flexibility the American dedicated gunship models never achieved. Performance characteristics. In practical terms, a single M134 minigun at 4,000 revolutions per minute setting could deliver approximately 65 rounds per second. Both guns firing simultaneously put 130 rounds downrange every second, a density of fire that fundamentally altered tactical calculations. Against area targets like tree lines harboring enemy forces, this created a beaten zone, roughly 50 meters long, where rounds impacted every few inches. Effective range was approximately 1,000 meters for area suppression, though accuracy at that distance was marginal. Optimal engagement range was 400 to 800 meters, close enough for concentrated fire, far enough to minimize small arms threat to the helicopter. Muzzle velocity of 2,850 feet per second, 868 meters per second, gave adequate penetration against jungle vegetation and light structures. The weapon's greatest advantage wasn't raw power, it was sustained fire capability. Where an M60 required 4 to 5 second breaks after every 200-round burst to prevent barrel failure, the M134's rotating barrel design meant each individual barrel fired only 650 to 700 rounds per minute. This distributed heat load allowed continuous fire for 30 to 60 seconds without barrel degradation. In practical terms, a Bushranger could dump 2,000 rounds on a target in a single firing pass without weapons malfunction, impossible with any other helicopter portable weapon system. Now, if you're finding this interesting, consider subscribing. We're building something here for people who actually care about the details, the engineering, the tactics, the stories that don't make it into the documentaries. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps the channel grow. Back to the Bushranger. April 21, 1969. The Bushranger gunships officially entered combat operations. Within 6 weeks, they'd be tested under conditions that would have destroyed conventional weapons systems, and would save Australian lives in ways that still resonate decades later. First combat. The SAS extraction, May 16, 1969. The call came in during late afternoon. SAS Patrol 15, a 4-man reconnaissance team, had been compromised near the Courtney Plantation on Phuoc Thi Province's northern border. What began as a quiet observation mission had deteriorated into a desperate fight for survival. The team was surrounded by a numerically superior enemy force and couldn't break contact. 3 transport Iroquois, callsign Albatross, launched from Nui Dat with extraction ropes deployed. 3 Bushranger gunships, callsigns Bushranger 71, 72, and 73, provided fire support. The distance, 25 kilometers. Flight time, minutes. Radio traffic painted a grim picture. The SAS team was heavily engaged. They couldn't reach a clearing for conventional extraction. Rope extraction under fire was the only option, and it required the transport helicopter to hover completely exposed while men climbed or were winched up. Squadron Leader Brian Dairu, flying Bushranger 71, A2-383, coordinated the fire support pattern. Unlike American gunship tactics that typically used 2 helicopters in alternating firing passes, the RAAF employed 3 Bushrangers in continuous rotation. 1 helicopter inbound on firing run, guns and rockets engaging. 1 helicopter just pulling off target, door guns firing rearward to maintain suppression. 3rd helicopter at the top of the circuit, turning inbound for its firing pass. The result: continuous fire on target, no gaps for the enemy to exploit. Albatross 02, piloted by New Zealand Flight Lieutenant Trevor Butler with Australian Flight Lieutenant Tony Wheel as co-pilot, descended toward the SAS team's position with extraction ropes deployed. Door gunners Alan Lamb and John Gibson manned their M60s. The helicopter was immediately hit by concentrated ground fire. The SAS team radioed urgently, "Bring it in closer, Bushrangers, they're right on top of us." Dairu rolled Bushranger 71 into the steepest firing pass of his career. Minigun fire walked toward the hovering transport helicopter. Rockets away. 1 rocket, fired to impact 20 meters in front of Albatross 02, appeared to be heading directly into the spinning rotor disc. For 2 seconds that felt like minutes, the rocket's smoke trail converged on the helicopter. Then it passed, 2 meters in front of the windscreen, close enough that Butler distinctly saw the rocket body, close enough that its explosion hammered the helicopter with blast overpressure. Butler's transmission, remarkably calm given the circumstances: "Hey, that's getting a bit bloody close." But on the ground, the SAS team saw something else entirely. That rocket, combined with minigun fire literally chewing through jungle vegetation, had broken the enemy assault. Their radio call was immediate: "That's shit-hot Bushrangers, you're right into them." The 3 Bushrangers continued their firing circuit, now directing suppressive fire within meters of Albatross 02's rotor disc. Minigun fire at point-blank range, 400 meters, 300 meters, finally as close as 200 meters from the hovering transport. SAS Patrol 15 grabbed the ropes. Albatross 02 lifted out of the jungle. The enemy fire reached a crescendo as the Vietnamese made a last desperate attempt to bring down the helicopter. All 3 Bushrangers took no hits. All 4 SAS soldiers extracted successfully. Total time over target, approximately 8 minutes. Combat Doctrine Evolution. Over the following months, the Bushrangers refined their tactics through continuous combat operations. The standard fire support pattern, 3 gunships in rotation maintaining continuous suppression, proved devastatingly effective. Each firing pass lasted approximately 15 to 20 seconds. 8 to 10 seconds of minigun fire walking across the target area, rockets released in the middle of the pass, miniguns continuing fire through the pull-off, then door gun M60s firing rearward as the helicopter climbed away from the target. This created an approximately 30-second window of continuous fire on any given target zone, 3 helicopters each firing for 15 to 20 seconds with overlapping coverage. The mathematics were overwhelming: 130 rounds per second from twin miniguns, multiplied by 15 seconds of firing, equals nearly 2,000 rounds per helicopter per pass. 3 helicopters in rotation delivered approximately 6,000 rounds on target area every circuit. Flight Lieutenant Chris Roberts, an SAS officer whose patrol was extracted under similar circumstances, later described the Bushrangers' effect. On one patrol in May 1969, southwest of the Courtney Rubber, my patrol was surrounded. We had enemy that I could actually see to the north, south and to the west, and I was pretty sure that they were in the thick country to the east of us. We waited there for about 3 hours and finally, as the sun was going down, I got a call that the Bushranger was on their way in. After the rockets came in, a lone helicopter came across the top of the trees and dropped 4 ropes to us. Both door gunners were firing, we were firing. We hooked onto the ropes and we came out and there was tracer absolutely going everywhere. We could see the enemy firing at us as we were pulled up through the trees. And I've got to say that my patrol owes its life to that very gallant pilot in 9 Squadron. Enemy assessment. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces quickly learned to recognize the Bushrangers' distinctive sound, the high-pitched buzz of miniguns at full rate. Captured prisoners consistently described the weapon as terrifying when interrogated about specific weapon systems. One prisoner of war interrogation report noted that enemy forces would attempt to disengage from contact as soon as they heard miniguns, recognizing that remaining in the area meant near certain casualties. This psychological effect multiplied the weapon's tactical value. The Bushrangers didn't just provide fire support, their presence altered enemy decision-making at operational level. Australian infantry commanders learned they could maneuver more aggressively knowing Bushranger fire support could cover withdrawals or suppress enemy counterattacks with minimal danger of friendly fire incidents due to the precision of pilot-controlled fires. Reliability statistics. A 2-773, the original Bushranger prototype, compiled the most comprehensive combat record. From September 1968 through December 1971, the aircraft flew hundreds of combat missions. Its weapons systems fired approximately 1.5 million minigun rounds and launched approximately 4,000 rockets. Battle damage: 5 minor hits from small arms fire, none causing mission abort or significant repairs. The minigun's mechanical reliability exceeded all predictions. Jams occurred at rates below 1 per 10,000 rounds, an order of magnitude better than M60 machine guns in similar conditions. When jams did occur, they were typically ammunition-related, defective rounds, rather than weapon malfunctions, and could often be cleared in flight by cycling the electric motor. Squadron maintenance records show that minigun barrel assemblies typically required replacement after 100,000 rounds, about 2 months of intensive combat operations. Motors and feed mechanisms proved even more durable, with some units accumulating over 250,000 rounds before requiring major maintenance. Tactical flexibility. The Bushranger configuration's greatest tactical advantage wasn't overwhelming firepower, it was flexibility. The same helicopter could fly gunship escort missions in the morning, be reconfigured to transport during lunch, evacuate wounded in the afternoon, and revert to gunship status by evening. This operational flexibility meant 9 Squadron could surge gunship capabilities during major operations while maintaining transport capacity for routine logistics. Individual Bushranger helicopters developed reputations. A 2-773 became legendary as the original Bushranger 72. Pilots requested specific aircraft for high-risk missions. Ground troops learned to recognize individual helicopters by their sound and markings. The psychological value of this cannot be overstated. Both Australian forces and enemy troops knew that when that specific helicopter appeared, the tactical situation was about to change dramatically. The Bushranger's influence extended far beyond individual firefights. At strategic level, the weapons system fundamentally altered Australian tactical doctrine for helicopter operations, changes that would influence RAAF thinking for decades. Prior to the Bushranger, Australian helicopter operations followed a largely reactive model. Helicopters responded to requests for transport or evacuation, relying on ground forces or fixed-wing aircraft for fire support. The Bushranger inverted this relationship. For the first time, helicopter units could proactively shape tactical situations through integrated fire and maneuver. SAS reconnaissance patrols, previously limited to observation and calling for artillery or airstrikes, gained a responsive fire support platform that could engage targets within minutes of detection. This transformed SAS operations from passive reconnaissance to active hunter-killer missions. Patrol insertion and extraction, historically the most dangerous phases, became measurably safer with Bushranger escort. Battle of Coral Balmoral impact. During the Battle of Coral Balmoral in May-June 1968, before the Bushranger was fully operational, 9 Squadron helicopters supported Australian infantry under intense fire. The experience demonstrated both the necessity and the gaps in available fire support. After Bushranger deployment in 1969 to 1971, similar engagements saw dramatically different outcomes. Australian infantry commanders gained confidence to execute more aggressive maneuvers knowing helicopter fire support could suppress enemy positions without the 15 to 30-minute delays typical of artillery or fixed-wing air support. Comparative effectiveness. Against U.S. Army gunship doctrine, The Australian approach offered distinct advantages and trade-offs. American dedicated gunship units flying H-1 Cobra attack helicopters carried heavier armaments including 40mm grenade launchers and tow missiles. But Cobras required dedicated maintenance, couldn't perform transport missions, and operated in specialized units separated from general aviation formations. The Bushranger's multi-role capability meant fire support was available whenever transport helicopters were available, no need to coordinate between separate units. Response times from initial contact to fire support overhead averaged 8 to 12 minutes for Bushrangers versus 15 to 25 minutes for dedicated U.S. gunships operating from separate bases. Legacy in Australian military doctrine. The Bushranger experience directly influenced post-Vietnam Australian military thinking. The concept of multi-role platforms with surge capability became embedded in RAAF doctrine. When Australia later acquired Black Hawk and then MRH-90 helicopters, the ability to rapidly configure between transport and armed roles was a stated requirement, a direct legacy of 9 Squadron's innovation. The principle extended beyond helicopters. Australian defence planning increasingly favoured flexible platforms over specialised systems, particularly for expeditionary operations where logistics and maintenance support were constrained. The Bushranger proved that small forces with adaptable equipment could achieve effects disproportionate to their numbers. Total mission statistics. By December 1971, when 9 Squadron withdrew from Vietnam, the unit had flown more than 237,000 missions. 6 squadron members were killed on operations. Aircraft losses remained remarkably low, 9 helicopters lost to all causes over 5.5 years, several to accidents rather than enemy fire. The Bushranger gunships accounted for a substantial portion of combat support missions. While exact numbers are difficult to isolate, squadron records indicate the Bushranger configured aircraft flew the majority of high-risk escort and fire support missions, particularly supporting SAS operations where the combination of precision and overwhelming firepower proved crucial. Production and service life. The M134 Minigun's production history reflects the peculiarities of Vietnam-era weapons procurement. General Electric manufactured approximately 10,000 miniguns during the Vietnam War years, produced at their Armament Systems Division facility in Burlington, Vermont. Unit cost in 1960s dollars, approximately $25,000 per complete weapon system including motor, feeder delinker, and control unit. 9 Squadron. Acquiring miniguns required creative logistics. Official procurement through Australian defence channels proved slow and complicated by U.S. allocation priorities. Wing Commander Dairou and squadron logistics officers reportedly utilized a combination of formal requests, inter-service transfers from U.S. Army units, and what military personnel politely term informal acquisition, obtaining components through personal relationships with American armorers who understood the Australian requirements. By 1970, 9 Squadron had configured 6 Bushranger helicopters from their fleet of 16 Iroquois. The remaining 10 aircraft flew standard transport configuration but could be converted to gunship role within hours if operational requirements dictated. Post-Vietnam service. The M134 Minigun continued U.S. military service through the 1970s and 1980s, though procurement ended with Vietnam's conclusion. Many original General Electric manufactured weapons sat in storage through the 1990s, as military drawdowns and changing tactical priorities reduced demand for helicopter door guns. In 1990, Dillon Aero, a precision machining company in Scottsdale, Arizona, acquired a large stock of Vietnam-era miniguns. Company engineers spent over a decade redesigning virtually every component, addressing the reliability issues that had plagued original models. By 2002, Dillon began producing the M134D, a comprehensively improved minigun featuring titanium components, upgraded motors, improved feeder delinker systems, and modular construction allowing easier maintenance. The M134D remains in production today, equipping U.S. military helicopters, special operations aircraft, and exported to allied nations. Modern versions feature variable rate of fire controls, improved ammunition handling, and have been adapted for ground vehicle mounts and naval applications. A second manufacturer, Garwood Industries, produces the M134G variant, similar improvements on the original General Electric design. Australian service continuation. 9 Squadron's Bushranger concept influenced later Australian helicopter operations, though the specific minigun configuration ended with Vietnam withdrawal. A 2-773, the original Bushranger prototype, returned to Australia and continued service with 9 Squadron, then 35 Squadron, then B Squadron 5th Aviation Regiment, Army, and finally Australian Army 1st Aviation Regiment. Its final operational mission occurred in 2001 during refugee management operations at Christmas Island. After a service life spanning 33 years and hundreds of thousands of flight hours, a 2-773 was retired in 2001 and transferred to the Australian War Memorial. The aircraft currently sits in storage at the AWM facility in Mitchell, Canberra, awaiting restoration to its Bushranger configuration for eventual museum display. Other Bushranger helicopters dispersed to various Australian military units post-Vietnam, most serving into the 1990s before replacement by more modern helicopter types. Several survive in museum collections, though a 2-773 remains the only aircraft planned for authentic Bushranger restoration. Modern equivalents. Today's military helicopters employ weapons systems far more sophisticated than the Bushranger. Integrated fire control computers, stabilized turrets, precision-guided munitions. But the core principle that made the Bushranger effective, overwhelming suppressive fire delivered from a stable, sustainable platform, remains unchanged. Modern door guns on helicopters from Black Hawks to Chinooks still frequently employ the M134D Minigun, testament to a design concept that proved itself over the jungles of Vietnam more than half a century ago. The M134 Minigun's influence on modern military aviation extends far beyond its original Vietnam-era role. Every modern military helicopter with provisions for defensive armament owes a conceptual debt to the weapons system integration principles tested under fire by 9 Squadron RAAF. The Bushranger's core innovation, pilot-controlled fixed forward-firing guns providing suppressive fire during critical phases of helicopter operations, became standard doctrine. Modern attack helicopters from the AH-64 Apache to the Eurocopter Tiger employ this principle, though with far more sophisticated aiming and stabilization systems. Design influence. The rotary cannon principle itself proliferated. Modern variants include the M61A2, still equipping most U.S. fighter aircraft, the Ju-8 Avenger 30mm cannon on the A-10 Thunderbolt II, and various smaller caliber systems adapted for naval close-in weapons systems, CIWS, and ground vehicle mounts. The mechanical elegance of distributing heat load across multiple barrels has proven adaptable to virtually every platform requiring high rates of sustained fire. Recognition and assessment. Military historians consistently cite 9 Squadron's Bushranger as one of the most successful field modifications of the Vietnam War. Dr. Alan Stevens, official historian of the RAAF, noted in his analysis of Vietnam helicopter operations that the Bushranger represented practical innovation under operational pressure, exemplifying the adaptive capacity that distinguished Australian forces in Vietnam. Wing Commander Brian Dairu, the Bushranger's primary architect, was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross in March 1969 for his role in developing the system and leading combat operations. His comprehensive monograph, The Bushranger Story, and So, a Gunship Was Born, remains the authoritative primary source document on the program's development and employment. Museum preservation. The Australian War Memorial holds extensive Bushranger documentation including technical drawings, operational reports, and combat film footage. The planned restoration of A2-773 to authentic Bushranger configuration represents one of the memorial's priority aircraft restoration projects, though funding and specialized expertise requirements have delayed work. Several aviation museums in Australia and the United States maintain M134 miniguns in their collections, though few are displayed in accurate Vietnam-era helicopter configurations. The minigun's dramatic appearance, 6 rotating barrels, ammunition feeds, electrical systems, makes it visually striking for museum displays, even without full historical context. Modern military perspective. Contemporary military analysis of the Bushranger emphasizes lessons that remain relevant. Dr. Albert Palazzo, Australian Army Research Centre, wrote in 2019, the Bushranger demonstrated that innovative integration of existing technology, adapted to specific operational requirements, often produces better outcomes than procurement of dedicated systems designed for generic scenarios. This principle should inform current acquisition strategy for small military forces operating in coalition environments. The weapon system's reliability, mechanical simplicity, external power source eliminating sensitivity to ammunition variables, distributed heat load, established design principles still followed in modern weapons development. When the U.S. military recently solicited requirements for a new common minigun variant, the specification emphasized many of the same attributes that made the original M134 successful: reliability in adverse conditions, sustained fire capability, and ease of maintenance. 6 barrels. 31 inches of rotating steel. An electric motor that pulled 80 amps and sounded like a chainsaw cutting through thunder. This was the weapon that kept firing when M60s jammed in monsoon rain. This was the weapon that cleared North Vietnamese positions in triple canopy jungles so thick sunlight never reached the ground. This was the weapon that SAS soldiers on the end of ropes, dangling through enemy fire, watching green tracers arc toward them, knew would keep their enemies' heads down long enough to survive. The Americans had the Cobra gunship with its 40mm grenade launchers and tow missiles. The Australians had a transport helicopter with a maintenance cruise Ingenuity bolted to its sides. In the jungles of Phuoc Thi province, when the call came over the radio, "Bushranger, we need you now," the weapon that responded wasn't the most advanced or the most expensive. It was simply the one that never stopped firing. And that made all the difference.